Resident Evil 5 is a third-person cooperative survival horror action game where you play as Chris Redfield and Sheva Alomar as they hunt bioterrorists in West Africa. The game is available on PC, PlayStation, Xbox consoles, as well as Nintendo Switch.
That's why.
Atmosphere. Resident Evil 5's locations in West Africa vary from marketplaces and desert hillsides to secret research labs and underground complexes, and the whole game is bathed in a green filter that goes some way to making the environments less pleasant, and alongside some more squalid locations, it can create a sense of revulsion to places that seem to have been left to decay, despite people living there. There's not much tension in the game besides one or two moments in quite a long game, with even the increased industrialization only making some places more oppressive the more machines you encounter. The game's co-op nature and emphasis on combat make the atmosphere hard to pay attention to when shooting things is more of a priority alongside the general silliness you'll experience that comes with multiplayer. Resident Evil 5 prioritizes its action over its atmosphere, and it's hard to find moments in the game where there's any of the latter at all. That's no Harry Mason's. Scares. The game doesn't really try any scary moments that stand out in its 12-hour playtime. The overwhelming number of things that feel like they're designed to be frightening are usually either the game suddenly thrusting the player into combat with traps, or various enemies making sudden and dramatic entrances. There's a few attacks from enemies that can be startling, but there's not much even in the combat that's really frightening. The enemies themselves can be gross in appearance and a lot of bosses are the same, but again, very few engagements with them are frightening. Chris and Sheva are more than capable to deal with them, and the overwhelming amount of ammo the game provided was more of an inventory management challenge and less of a fight for survival. The game's cutscenes seem to be missing the quick-time events that made some of them alarming to suddenly have to deal with, and it's left Resident Evil 5 as more of an action game as a result. That's still no Harry Mason's. Sound design. The soundtrack still has echoes of its previous incarnations residing in its tracklist, with the pauses between gameplay sounding really moody like a lot of its more subtle tracks. There's a lot of great tension music with more 90s string pieces that once again take me back to the X-Files, as well as the songs that reflect the country the game is set in, with more percussion resembling traditional African djembes to remind you where you are. But the soundtrack only comes in occasionally, leaving you alone with the ambiance. Birds cawing, the wind, the sound of footsteps, creaking metal tracks in the mines. There's a load of great sound design going on, and the sound effects from the menus to the gameplay are all really appropriate and realistic. It's great stuff.
We were partners. What about you? Why'd you join the BSAA?
My parents were involved in an accident caused by a pharmaceutical company when I was young.
Umbrella?
Yes. I only found out later that the accident was to cover up the manufacturing of biological weapons for terrorists. We're using Africa as a test bed for their experiments.
The voice acting for Sheva and Chris is pretty good, but the other characters like Wesker and Irving sound pretty cheesy. Not that it hurts the experience at all. The voice and sound effects reverberated nicely in the cave sections and narrow corridors very realistically. The game is a real treat for headphone users on so many levels. That's one Harry Mason.
Freeze!
Gore. The game only has a few memorable gory parts, but they stand out quite dramatically, with some really barbaric scenes of enemies force-feeding people the parasite that controls them, and it's pretty gross stuff. The animations for the parasites coming out of people's heads is also greatly improved over Resident Evil 4. The game really benefits from a high frame rate to see all the weird tendrils and legs flailing around. Regular combat doesn't reveal as much blood as previous or future games from what I remember, but blowing up an enemy's head is still satisfying. The gore is still fun, and it's about the only thing that reminds you you're supposed to be playing a horror game sometimes. That's 2 Harry Masons. Story. Chris Redfield arrives in West Africa with the aid of local operative Sheva Alomar to chase the story of bioterrorism in the area and apprehend a smuggler. But after only moments in the region, they realize things are very wrong with their operation, leaving them seemingly alone in hostile territory. The story has quite a few high points with character backstories like Sheva's and the parts that tie in with Resident Evil 0 and 7. On the other hand, there's also some more bizarre detours like the underground civilization and the literal supervillain story that the game builds up to. But whilst it seems strange, it all does work into the story, even if loosely. The story feels semi-grounded in some scenes, but really escapes its chains and goes wildly out of control the further into it you go, never looking back. But despite everything, the co-op gameplay will often lead to things like the long diary entries being ignored and the cheesy moments being the things you remember the most. The story is there and it's got some pretty decent moments, but it's really down to the player whether they can find the time to stop and appreciate it when the game's focus is so heavily on action. Making the final score 3 out of 5 Harry Masons. Resident Evil 5 was a load of fun to play, but you can see the trend that Capcom was taking at the time to push the horror elements to the side to make more action-based gameplay the norm, and playing with a friend was really enjoyable, but only made the horror less noticeable. Again, I'd like to remind you the whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games. If you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I punched that boulder, I didn't let Jill die and advise you don't either. There'll be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. Now let's go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace.